Story 1. The first story comes from a man, Tom Harris, a 27-year-old software developer who, at the time, was living alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Oregon. His house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, backed by a dense patch of woods, which offered him a sense of privacy he had come to enjoy. But one rainy Tuesday night, that feeling of seclusion would be shattered forever. It was around 11 p.m. when Tom heard a soft, hesitant knock on his front door. He wasn't expecting anyone. His friends knew to text before coming over, and deliveries never arrived this late. He muted the TV, listening intently. The only sound was the rhythmic drumming of rain against the windows. Cautiously, he got up from his couch and peered through the peephole. The porch light cast a weak, yellow glow on his empty doorstep. There was no one there. But just as he was about to turn away, he caught a flicker of movement at the very edge of the fisheye, a shadow, seemingly detaching itself from the deeper darkness of his yard and melting away into the night. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank by some local kids, or perhaps just a trick of the light, a reflection distorted by the rain on the lens. Shaking his head, he went back to the living room, but the sense of unease lingered. A few minutes later, the knock came again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. 3 distinct, forceful raps that echoed through the quiet house. Tom's heart began to pound in his chest. He grabbed his phone and pulled up the feed from his front door security camera, which he had installed just a month prior. The live view showed his porch, slick with rain, but completely deserted. He rewound the footage, scrubbing back to the moment he heard the knock. On the screen, he saw nothing, no person, no animal, not even a branch blowing in the wind. The timestamp on the recording matched the exact moment he heard it, yet the porch remained still. It was then that his phone buzzed in his hand, not with a notification, but with a text message from an unknown number. His blood ran cold as he read the 6 short words, "I can see you." He scrambled to the window, his eyes darting across the dark, rain-swept street. He saw nothing but empty sidewalks and the dim lights of his neighbors' houses. He felt a profound sense of violation, the feeling of being watched by an unseen predator. His home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Shaking, he locked all the doors and windows, his mind racing. Who was doing this? And how did they know he was alone? With trembling fingers, Tom dialed 911. He explained the situation to the dispatcher, the phantom knocks, the unnerving text message, the empty camera footage. He felt a little foolish, as if he were overreacting, but the fear was too palpable to ignore. A patrol car arrived within 10 minutes. 2 officers did a thorough sweep of his property, their flashlights cutting through the darkness and the downpour. Call again if anything else happened. They checked the perimeter, the backyard, and the dense tree line behind the house. After 20 minutes, they came back to the front door, their expressions patient but unconvinced. They had found nothing, no signs of a break-in, no footprints in the muddy patches of his lawn, no one hiding in the bushes. One of the officers suggested it might have been a technical glitch with his camera or a simple prank. They advised him to keep his doors locked and call again if anything else happened. The rest of the night passed in a state of hypervigilance. Tom barely slept, jolting awake at every creak of the house settling. The following night, he tried to establish a sense of normalcy, but the silence of the house felt heavy, suffocating. Exhausted, he finally drifted off to sleep on the couch around midnight. He was woken sometime later not by a sound, but by a feeling, a primal instinct that screamed he was not alone. He opened his eyes, and his breath caught in his throat. In the dim light filtering in from the street, he could hear it, the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing coming from the far corner of his living room. It was slow and deep, and it was not his own. He lay perfectly still, paralyzed with terror, listening as the sound continued for what felt like an eternity before abruptly stopping. When he finally mustered the courage to turn on a lamp, the room was empty. The next morning, He checked his security camera footage from the night before. His heart sank as he watched. At 2:13 a.m., a figure materialized at the edge of his property, just beyond the reach of the motion sensor light. It was tall and unnaturally thin, a mere silhouette against the darkness. It didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still, for over an hour. It seemed to be staring directly into the camera lens, an unblinking, silent sentinel. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. That was the final straw. Tom knew he couldn't stay there another night. But he was also filled with a defiant anger. He decided to set a trap. That evening, he propped a small, empty can on the inside of the front door handle. If anyone tried to jiggle the knob, the can would fall, alerting him. He sat in the dark, armed with a heavy fireplace poker, his eyes glued to the security camera feed on his phone. Hours passed. Then, at almost the exact same time as the night before, the figure appeared on his screen. It stood in the same spot, a void in the darkness. Tom watched, his knuckles white, as the figure slowly began to drift towards his front porch. It moved without walking, gliding over the grass like a wisp of smoke. It stopped right in front of his door, just out of the peephole's view. Tom held his breath, waiting for the sound of the handle turning, for the can to fall. But nothing happened. After a minute of agonizing silence, he couldn't take it anymore. In a surge of adrenaline-fueled rage, he flung the door open, ready to confront whoever or whatever was tormenting him. The porch was empty. The air was cold and still. The police arrived again, this time finding a single piece of evidence, a set of deep footprints in the soft soil next to his porch. But the prints were bizarre. They were barefoot, unnaturally long, and they started in the middle of the lawn and led nowhere. They simply stopped. There were no tracks leading to them or away from them. Tom moved out the next day. He broke his lease, packed his things, and never looked back. But the terrifying part, the texts never stopped. Even months later, from new, unknown numbers, a chilling reminder of the thing that watched him in the night. On the first night, a snowstorm began to roll in, blanketing the surrounding forest in a thick shroud of white. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. As the three friends sat around the fireplace playing cards, they heard a noise. It was the distinct sound of footsteps, crunching in the snow just outside the main window. Jake muted the small speaker playing music. They all listened. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The steps were slow and heavy, methodically pacing back and forth along the side of the cabin. Emily's brow furrowed. "Who would be out there?" she whispered. The owner said, "We're the only ones 4 miles." Jake stood up and peered out the window, but the falling snow was so thick it was like looking at a white wall. The unsettling part wasn't just that someone was out there in a blizzard. It was that there was no road for anyone to walk on. Their car was the only vehicle, and their tire tracks, already being covered by the storm, were the only sign of passage. The footsteps eventually faded, but a seed of unease had been planted. The next day, the feeling that they were being watched intensified. Strange things started to happen. While making breakfast, Sarah noticed a series of long, deep scratches on the wooden wall by the kitchen, marks that none of them had seen the night before. They looked as if an animal had clawed at the wood, but the marks were too high up for any bear or mountain lion. Later, they realized their phones had no signal. It wasn't surprising given their remote location, but the complete lack of even a single bar felt ominous, severing their last tie to the outside world. That afternoon, hoping to distract themselves, Emily decided to explore the cabin. In the small, dusty attic, tucked away in an old wooden chest, she found a leather-bound diary. The entries were dated decades ago, written in faded, spidery handwriting by a woman who had once lived in the cabin. As Emily read, a chill went down her spine. The woman wrote of being tormented by a constant feeling of being watched, of hearing footsteps circling the cabin at night, and of seeing a tall, shadowy figure standing among the trees, just observing. As dusk fell, the strange occurrences escalated. While washing dishes, Emily glanced up at the kitchen window and her heart stopped. For just a split second, she saw a pale face with dark, hollowed-out eyes staring in at her before it vanished back into the swirling snow. She cried out, and Jake and Sarah rushed over. But there was nothing there. They tried to convince her it was just a reflection, a trick of the fading light, but Emily knew what she had seen. Later that evening, as they huddled together in the living room, a chair in the corner of the room scraped loudly across the wooden floor, sliding a few inches on its own. They all saw it. There was no explanation. Doors would creak open and slam shut in empty rooms. And then came the whispers. Faint, guttural sounds that seemed to ride on the wind, seeping through the walls of the cabin. At one point, they all clearly heard a voice, raspy and cold, whisper 3 words that made their blood freeze. "You shouldn't be here." Terror had now fully consumed them. The cozy getaway had become a prison. They barricaded the door with a heavy sofa and decided they would leave at first light, no matter how bad the snow was. They spent the night sleepless, huddled together, listening to the relentless wind and the other, more sinister sounds that came from the darkness outside. When the first grey light of dawn broke through the clouds, they wasted no time. They threw their bags into the car, their movements frantic. The snow had stopped, and the world was silent and white, completely among the trees. As Jake started the engine, Emily looked back at the path they had just made from the cabin door to the car. Her breath hitched. Alongside their own frantic footprints was another set. They were long, narrow, and barefoot, pressed deep into the snow. The tracks followed theirs perfectly, step for step, as if something had been walking right behind them, mimicking their every move. They stared in horror as they drove away, watching in the rearview mirror as the solitary set of footprints led from their car back towards the silent woods, before vanishing completely among the trees. Story 3. Working the night shift isn't for everyone. The long, silent hours can play tricks on your mind, making you see things that aren't there and hear sounds that don't exist. But what Brian Mitchell experienced during his time as a convenience store clerk was far worse than anything his imagination could have ever cooked up. His nightmare began subtly, with the late-night arrival of a man in a dark hoodie, his face completely obscured by the shadows it cast. The man would enter the small, brightly lit gas station and simply stand there. He never approached a counter, never grabbed a drink from the cooler, and never so much as glanced at the snacks lining the shelves. He would just pick a spot near the back of the store, by the aisle with the motor oil and car fresheners, and remain perfectly still. Brian tried to be polite at first, asking if he needed any help, but the man never responded. He would just stand there for 10, maybe 15 minutes, before turning and walking out as silently as he had come in. After the 3rd consecutive night of this bizarre behavior, a knot of unease began to tighten in Brian's stomach. He mentioned it to his manager, who brushed it off as just another small-town weirdo. But Brian knew it was more than that. He started paying closer attention. The man always appeared at precisely 13 a.m. and always stood in the exact same spot, a silent sentinel in the sterile quiet of the store. One particularly stormy night, Brian decided he'd had enough. He locked the main entrance as soon as his shift started, putting up the closed for cleaning sign, hoping to deter his unwelcome guest. He watched the clock tick past 13 a.m. Nothing. A wave of relief washed over him. Maybe that was all it took, but when he reviewed the security footage later that morning, a cold dread crept up his spine. The tape clearly showed the front door sliding open at 13 a.m., the man in the hoodie gliding inside and taking his usual position, all while the lock was visibly engaged. That's when things started to escalate. Small, almost unnoticeable things at first. A bag of chips that had been on a hook would be on the floor. The coffee pots, which Brian meticulously cleaned and left empty, would have a few drops of dark liquid at the bottom. The other employees started complaining about it too. The morning shift girl mentioned strange, inexplicable cold spots near the back of the store, even on the hottest days. The weekend guy swore he heard faint, sibilant whispering when he was alone in the stockroom, like someone was telling secrets just out of earshot. The feeling of being watched became a constant, oppressive weight on Brian's shoulders. Then the notes started appearing. They were written on crumpled receipts, left right on the counter for him to find when he came in. The first one was simple, just 3 words, "I see you." The next one was more chilling. "I know your routine." Brian's blood ran cold. This wasn't just some random prank, this was personal. He felt a paranoia he had never known, checking over his shoulder on his drive home, peering out his windows into the dark before going to bed. He was being stalked, and his sanctuary, the brightly lit convenience store, had become the epicenter of his fear. Driven by a mixture of terror and desperation, Brian decided to confront whatever was tormenting him. One night, he deliberately drove to work an hour earlier than his shift was scheduled to start. The parking lot was empty, and the store was dark, just as it should have been. But as he got closer, his heart hammered against his ribs. Through the large glass windows, he could see a silhouette standing inside the unlit store. It was him, the man in the hoodie, standing in his usual spot, shrouded in almost complete darkness. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Brian fumbled with his keys and unlocked the door, the chimes sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. The lights flickered on automatically as he stepped inside. He called out, his voice trembling, "Who are you? What do you want?" He took a step toward the back aisle, his eyes fixed on the spot where the man had been standing, but there was nothing there. The aisle was empty. The man had simply vanished. Shaking, Brian hurried to the small office in the back to check the security camera feed. He rewound the footage to the moment he had arrived, his eyes scanning the monitor. The camera showed him pulling into the empty parking lot, walking to the door, and entering the dark, vacant store. According to the unblinking eye of the camera, the man in the hoodie was never there at all.